Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to Google for inviting me. It is a real treat to be here, let me tell you. All photography requires light, but the sudden intrusive light of flash photography is unique. It's quite unlike the illumination that comes from the sun or even from artificial lighting. Flash is the first book to tell the history of flash and its effects and associations in a way that links it to the broader history of photography. And I'm interested in it in particular because flash photography breaks down familiar categories and hierarchies since it's used across the board. It's used for fine artwork, it's used for news photography, it's used for amateur snapshots. It's been used to reveal shocking social conditions. It puts on display the most overlooked corners of everyday life. Paparazzi chase celebrities with flash. Large public events and intimate family occasions are captured through flash. Flash is used to record and detect crime and its aftermath. What's more, flash is used not just to illuminate darkness, but also, so to speak, to stop time. It allows one to photograph really rapidly moving objects, like the ball of ice cream that's being flipped into a milkshake. So in the book, I ask, what is it that makes flash photography so distinctive? And I think, too, about flash's associations, like the connection of flash with memory. I do things like tracing the origin of the cinematic flashback, and I think about the concepts of flash drives or flashbulb memories. So this history is about several things. It's about a piece of technological apparatus, or rather successive pieces of apparatus that are used to provide enough illumination to take an effective photograph in a particular place at a particular time when there wouldn't otherwise be enough light to do so. It's concerned, too, with the practice of flash photography and the uses to which it's been put. And more provocatively, it's about light itself and its relationship to time. So I ask questions like, how long is a flash? And then what happens if a flash is too bright? Can one have too much light? As with the biggest flash of all, that of the atomic bomb. So in a moment, I'm going to elaborate on 4 specific features, and I want to locate them in various phases of flash photography's history. I want to think about the sense of astonishment and awe that it originally evoked. I want to think about that capacity to stop time. I want to think about flash's ability to light up dark places, to break into darkness. And I want to think, too, about flash's associations with violence and aggressiveness and invasiveness and intrusion. And then I'm going to wind up by looking at the work of some contemporary photographers whose experimentation rescues flash photography from the bad press that it's increasingly received during the 20th and 21st century. But first, a little bit of history. So the history of flash goes right back to the early days of photography, when people needed more light than was provided by sunlight or daylight. And they tried to use, first of all, limelight and then brightly burning magnesium to provide illumination. And I think that this is the very first photograph to be taken by flash. It was taken using limelight in 1839. It's actually a daguerreotype of a fossil. But it was so hit and miss for a number of decades. In most circumstances, limelight produced really over-bleached images. Magnesium was somewhat better. It was burnt as wire to take pictures of caves. It was blown in powder form through a flame. It certainly produced better images. But until extraction became cheaper in the 1880s, magnesium was not just expensive, but it was somewhat unreliable. And then, all importantly, in 1887, a compound flash powder was invented by a couple of German chemists. And this could be exploded in so-called flash guns. Early ones even looked like a very crude pistol. It could be ignited on a tray. It was available for do-it-yourself mixing. It was supplied on impregnated sheets, or it was made into little explosive devices, rather like tea bags. And then the flash bulb, pioneered in the late 1920s, coming into more general use around 1930. Its ease, its portability, completely transformed news journalism. The earliest cheap cameras with synchronized flash date from around 1940, and then after World War II, a line stretches from little flash bulbs to flash cubes to the electronic flash that's now a built-in part of most consumer cameras. And then there's also that bright burst of LED light that one finds on cell phones. These developments overlapped, and there are many variants to be found within flash's technology. What remains linked and what remains constant, though, is the linking of flash photography in advice manuals, in specialist publications, in advertising with the modern, indeed with the flashy. There's a great TV ad from the 1960s that goes, "It's new, it's now, it's Flash Cube," together with some very kind of Dave Clark 5 style music, and linking flash to the dance floor and to the swinging 60s. And then you see here on the right how Sylvania flash bulb publicity even offered the homemaker, for $3 and a coupon, a foam rubber Sylvania pop art pillow. You can make your home swing now for practically no money at all. You too can have a picture of a flash bulb there in your living room. And yes, I found one on eBay, and I do. What's in flash photography? Sorry, but okay, before I go on to those 4 categories I was talking about, I want to make an important point, and it's one that has excited me in conceptual terms throughout my research. And that point is that flash photography is a practice that overturns some of what we think that we know about photography. Because in flash photography, the exposure is based on the very brief flaring of an intense light. It's not you take a picture and it's like a freezing of a moment of time in a continuity that's going on both sides of it. You create the light yourself with flash photographs. They're not based on the opening and closing of a shutter according to the strength of a continuously available light source. Rather, flash causes that sudden interruption. It breaks into the darkness. It's human-made. What's more, if, as can so easily happen in flash photography, the flash gets reflected onto a window pane or a polished surface, one's really directly reminded of the artifice and the technology involved in the illumination. And we see this too when, as here, the brightness of the flash results in part of the plate or film being flooded with light. And we see here even the hand of the photographer setting off that flash in its tray. And occasionally too, other forms of flash apparatus appear, as there. John Collier's photograph of a family in northern New Mexico. When it's so obvious as it is in these photographs that a flash has been used, we can no longer believe in the fiction that somehow the lens of the camera operates as the photographer's eye. Indeed, at the very moment of taking the flash photograph, the photographer, if she's close to her camera, is going to have her vision momentarily blinded just as dramatically and uncomfortably as her subject. So the eruption of flash disorients subject and photographer alike. And that's something that's used to really great effect, of course, near the end of Hitchcock's Rear Window, where the effect is really something like having, seeing the flash from inside your own eyeball. So let's look in more detail at 4 central features of flash photography, starting with the shockingly bright explosion of light itself and its capacity for creating astonishment. Flashes of light have for a long time been associated with sudden inspiration and clarity. Think about the revelation of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. And in the early decades of flash photography, some of its practitioners appropriated this sense of quasi-divine revelation, especially if they were using flash to expose deplorable social conditions. Jacob Riis, for example, working as an investigative journalist in New York in the late 1880s, saw himself, as he took up this new technology, as providing illumination. And the transcendental overtones of his vocabulary helped to underscore its significance as an instrument of intervention and purgation. I hate darkness and dirt anywhere, and naturally want to let in the light, he said. In the early decades of flash photography, commentators looked for appropriate language in which to write about it. If a theologically based vocabulary suited some of its ends, if occasionally it was called bottled sunlight, the most pervasive metaphor used to describe flash was the phenomenon of lightning. Because lightning shocks, startles, interrupts the moment, or creates it rather in a sudden instant of illumination, rendering everything around it preternaturally clear by contrast to the surrounding darkness. Lightning was commonly used in romantic art and writing, think of Frankenstein, to invoke awe, grandeur, the sublime, the unknowable, or even being shocked by some sudden light. Looking to borrow the connotations of this electrical energy, Adolf Meter and Johannes Geidecker, who invented the first flash powder in 1887, called it Blitzlichtpulver, or lightning light powder. And lightning bolts, as at the bottom, as here, long continued to feature in the advertising of flash bulbs and cameras. And indeed, there's probably one of those bolts signifying a flash feature on your cell phone right now. The artificial flash and the flash of lightning seem superficially really close. Indeed, they're compressed and amalgamated in this deliberately brief poem by Bill Knott, Flash. In its entirety, it flares up and reads, "Photographs, lightning bolts which, their shadows having caught up with them, perish." But in fact, lightning and the photographic flash are very different. Lightning is unpredictable. It's uncontrollable in its occurrence and its location. When you represent lightning, almost always it means being at some kind of distance from it. Flash photography doesn't give us any such distance. It's often quite literally in your face. In other words, flash doesn't live up to those awe-inspiring expectations set up for it through a comparison with lightning. And above all, that's because it's the product of human agency. But exploring the differences between the two, I found really productive because it's helped me understand what is distinctive about flash as a technological form of illumination. It also brings home that long-lasting desire to make grandiose claims for the almost divine properties of technology, even as technology here is coupled with the innovative and the modern. And being coupled with the innovative leads us to the whole idea of stopping time, because the technology of flash is about speed as well as about light. The word flash is commonly used, as you know, in all kinds of contexts, not necessarily visual ones, to indicate the extremely short or the transitory or the spontaneous, as in flash mobs and flash floods and flash fiction. The two meanings of the word, signifying speed, signifying light, converge in high-speed photography. Photographic pioneer Fox Talbot in 1851 was the first to patent the use of a spark to capture a moving object. That was an experiment said to have been suggested by how lightning flash at night seems to freeze drops of rain or freeze the water playing in a fountain so it looks stationary. Unfortunately, there's only verbal, no visual evidence for this. We have to wait until the work of Arthur Worthington in the late 19th century. He showed us what a splash really looks like by using electrical spark photography. Then, most notably, there are the really beautiful pictures produced by Harold Egerton in the mid-20th century. And Egerton's high-speed images, made by very high-speed bursts of light from electrically controlled neon tubes, created the illusion of stopped motion, whether he's showing milk drops falling or bullets piercing playing cards or bananas or balloons, or whether he's showing golfers or tennis players swinging at balls. These are photographs that break down the distinctions between science and art, and they reveal far more than is ever available to the human eye. They're a really powerful manifestation of what Walter Benjamin called the optical unconscious. High-speed flashes techniques continue to be used by photographers to create eye-catching, arresting effects. Japanese photographer Shinichi Maruyama, for example, has produced these images by throwing water here or ink into the air and then capturing the forms as they fall. Ori Gerst's work simultaneously references old master paintings and Harold Egerton, when, for example, he shows a bullet exploding a freeze-dried pomegranate into an airy ball of shards. Hiroshi Sugimoto's Theatres series, consisting of long exposure photographs taken in cinemas, which produce an image of a plain, extremely bright white light on the screen, is, in some ways, though, the antithesis of flash. He actually has his lens open for 2 or more hours, the length of the movie. And the end result is this really stunningly bright, blank rectangle. It's a composite image. It's a record of the many, many flashes that go to make up the motion picture, certainly in pre-digital form. It's a film distilled into a flash. What's more, as Sugimoto puts it, this is not simply white light. He calls it the result of too much information. And I think that this last phrase can be seen as a rebuff to the speed with which we're invited to view, to experience, to consume not just a film, but culture in general, life in general. Sugimoto is saying we're not given enough time to reflect. there are too many continual demands on our attention made by the rapid interruptions of technological modernity. Flash photography's relationship to time has always been a really double-edged one. It allows one to see the beauties of a moment that we couldn't ever visually process without mechanical aids. But it's also been continually associated, especially in the second half of the 20th century and beyond, with a kind of here today, gone tomorrow speediness of superficial consumer culture. Somehow, flash photography still is hung around with all of those associations with flashiness and superficiality. But flash, obviously enough, is extraordinarily useful. And let's think about what happens when it's used to light up dark places. I've already talked about Jakob Ries's desire for the social and illumination and transformation that he thought flash photography could bring about. And this is something that he shared with other documentarians like Lewis Hine, or like one of the earliest American woman photojournalists, Jessie Tarbox Beals, who exposed both the despair of poverty and the drive towards respectability that she witnessed in the tenements of Newark, New Jersey. Flash, in other words, has been indispensable to the practice of documentary. It's in relation to documentary that we encounter most starkly its most singular and its most contradictory aspects. On the one hand, its impetus towards revelation and its capacity to render visible what we would otherwise never see, and on the other, its associations with unwelcome intrusion. Documentary work brings out as well a further notable characteristic of flash photography, and that's its impetus towards the democratic, the way in which it gives emphasis to all the elements of an interior. Because especially in the early decades of its use, in the 1890s, the 1900s, it really couldn't be carefully controlled. So many details very often take on a kind of unplanned prominence. A sudden flare of light reveals with clarity each dent on a kitchen utensil, each photograph on a mantel shelf, or each image hanging or pasted on the walls, each cherished ornament, each piece of polished furniture, or stained and scuffed floor, or domestic cat, or marble fireplace, each accumulation of dust, each shiny button, each wrinkle. Flash can bring something out of obscurity. It can reveal details never fully visible to those who experience them on a daily basis. And this giving prominence to objects in an apparently kind of random assemblage is one major way in which flash's usefulness is invoked for so-called visual anthropology. Visual anthropology is a term pioneered by the farm security photographer John Collier, seen here flaring his flash onto a dressing table of objects in a Pueblo home, where you see both traditional bits of Pueblo ceremonial materials and family photographs, and a very modern alarm clock, and a little figurine of a horse, and a whip on the right-hand side, all kinds of things. The detail that flash gives us can deepen our knowledge of a material environment and of the lives of those who live there. And I think that much of the fascination of early flash photography, of the images that I've just shown you, come precisely from this privileged access to the lives of others. Flash, as well as being responsible for a violent interruption, allowed for the preservation and representation of the ordinary, of what Jacques Rancière in his aesthesis really beautifully terms the apprehension of the inexhaustible historicity found at every street corner, in every skin fold, and at every moment of time. Flash, that is to say, is associated not just with that rapid explosion of light, but with enabling and encouraging a form of attentive looking turned upon very everyday surroundings. Now, the invention of the flash bulb made documenting interiors even easier. This is something that we see reflected in the archives of the Farm Security Administration. We've just seen a couple of examples in the early 1930s and the early 1940s. It also gave more control. While flash readily makes visible every last stain, smudge, and scratch, it can also work to emphasize cleanliness and respectability. Some of the FSA photographers, though, were really reluctant to use flash, and this brings us to the last of the areas that I want to consider, and that's flash's association with violence, aggression, and invasiveness. Because it's really fair to ask, what, if anything, might justify flash's unexpected intrusion into daily lives, especially if you don't know the photographer already? Among the FSA photographers, Dorothea Lange, for example, saw its use as really invasive. Ben Shahn had some doubts both about photographing someone else's private space, but also about flash's very aesthetic. When some of the people came in and began to use flash, he said, and he's looking back to the late 1930s, I thought it was immoral. You know, you come into a sharecropper's cabin and it's dark, but a flash destroyed that darkness. It's true that a flash would actually illuminate the comic papers that they used to paste on their walls, but what met to the biggest impact on him, he said, was not actually the poverty that walls papered like this revealed, but something far less tangible, something that in fact was far less easy to record. It was, he said, the darkness, the glistening of eyes, the glistening of a brass ornament on top of a big bed, you know, a glass, a mirror that would catch light. Now, that's a matter of personal judgment about this thing, whether you divulge everything, as a flash would do, or whether things are kept mysterious as they are viewed. This refusal to use flash was in part a question of ethics, but it was also in part a desire to grant darkness its own mysterious qualities. It was also for many mid-century photographers a desire just to use so-called available light as a matter of purity and a matter of distinguishing themselves as art photographers from news photographers or commercial photographers. Cartier-Bresson in particular wanted no photographs taken with the aid of flashlight, if only out of respect for the actual light, even where there is not any of it. He said that to use flash is impolite, like coming to a concert with a pistol in your hand. The African-American Roy de Carava said, I don't try and alter light, which is why I never use flash. I hate it with a passion because it obliterates what I saw. Of course, the introduction of the flash bulb had greatly enhanced the ability of press photographers to work at night, and so it consolidated the association of flash newspaper photographers and the documentation of crimes committed under the cover of darkness. Flash was increasingly used by police forces, by journalists, even by detectives for recording crimes and criminals. and it inspired detective fiction and film. I really recommend George Harmon Cox's Flash Casey, and less recommend the TV series Man with a Camera from the 1950s, largely because it is so obviously a vehicle, a commercial vehicle for Sylvania flashbulbs. It's a huge plug for them, so much so that the star, Charles Bronson, he complained really grumpily that by the 10th week I realized I was playing second banana to a flashbulb. But nobody more famously brought flash and crime together than Ouija, recording murders, accidents, arrests. His self-publicity was completely synonymous with his Graflex Speed graphic camera and its flash synchronizer, to the extent that he once montaged himself into a flashbulb. Even Ouija, though, despite his reliance on the flash gun, expressed some ambiguity about its powers. And the frontispiece to his 1945 photo book, Naked City, suggests through visual irony that he knew it was possible to stand back from flash's illumination and acknowledge a potentially more sublime electrical force. I think this is a really atypical moment of humility on Ouija's part. Overall, his work added to that growing association of the flash with aggression and intrusiveness, especially in the hands of the rapacious and sensation-seeking news photographer. And nowhere has this determined intrusiveness been more apparent than in the work of paparazzi. The popping of flashbulbs has become visual shorthand for the achievement of fame or notoriety. And this firing off a barrage of light can be a terrifying onslaught. Think of King Kong, brought to New York City, exhibited on stage, and then startled into destructive rage by the flashes of newspaper photographers. Paparazzi flash has come to equal unwelcome exposure, and paparazzi themselves have really worked as a stand-in for the worst excesses of the exploitative, the invasive photographer, caring for nothing other than hunting down the shot. So if flash photographers have come to take on a bad name, in my conclusion, I'm going to really ask, can flash photography be redeemed? Flash photography is no longer awe-inspiring. Indeed, it still can disturb us today, and largely, I guess, because we experience it as invading our private space, hurting our eyes, breaking into whatever we might be looking at or thinking about. By and large, photographic flash has lost its novelty. It's certainly lost all association it might ever have had to the sublime. It's now a finely tuned means of creating and controlling light, not just illuminating darkness, but providing fill flash, or as Martin Parr does, intensifying colour. But however pragmatic this might be, it's very much been at the expense of an aesthetics that emphasises the surprising, the unpredictable, and the revelatory. But in contemporary photography, flash has recently come to take on a strong self-referential presence, and often this calls attention to one or more of the major themes that I've talked about: illumination, speed, violence, paparazzi. And sometimes photographers try to recapture some of its early properties, showing that it can still captivate and astound. Flash illumination registers most obviously when the photographer deliberately calls attention to the artifice that they're employing, as here, not least by calling the image flash, or in Maya Dickerhoff's image, family, from a series which is called Memory. And this is an image that riffs off amateur mistakes, getting too close with the flash, bleaching out what it is that you really want to take the photograph of, the family grouping in the middle. Where it's titled, though, or the title of the series, Memory, it speaks to how difficult it can be to recollect a moment except through a photograph, because that bleaching light stands for time's passage, the fading, obliterating effects of memory that family photography so desperately tries to deny. Or a quite different genre, paparazzi work, is appropriated by Cindy Sherman in Untitled Film Still, number 54. And so here she's caught in flash of sudden glare with her expression somewhere between surreptitious and angry. It's sort of somewhere between Marilyn Monroe and Princess Di. Or consider the series by German artist Victoria Binstock, Flash. In pale greys and whites, her images show very faintly, barely discernible, a celebrity actor walking through a crush of photographers entering their car. And I think the point that she is making is that both image and celebrity may be said to be overexposed through flash. This intense bleaching, of course, recalls flash's largest and most deadly form, one that I showed earlier, the flash of the nuclear bomb, the extreme point reached by flashes that accompany potentially lethal activity. The close relationship of flash photography to actual weaponry is explicitly referenced in British photographer Sarah Pickering's Celestial Objects series. Unlike Harold Edgerton, who uses a strobe light to turn the flight of a bullet into a disconcerting thing of beauty rather than a display of force, Pickering opens up her camera shutter and photographs a bullet fired from a revolver in the complete dark. All the light comes from the explosion itself. In her use of darkness and flame, the blur of light and the white-hot core of gunpowder's ignition, she returns flash photography to the unpredictable and thrilling category of the sublime. And the raw power of electrical discharge, too, is still being used by photographers. Floris Naussus made his Nachtbilder, his night photos, by leaving sheets of photographic paper out at night in thunderstorms so that they carry the imprint of exposures made by lightning. And Hiroshi Sugimoto's Lightning Fields project deliberately harks back to earlier technological experimentation, like Etienne Leopold Tourvelot's studies of sparks, as well too through its title, Lightning Fields, evoking the potential for natural sublimity inherent in Walter de Maria's New Mexican installation. As with Naussus's work, no camera is involved in Sugimoto's Lightning Fields. He introduced a Van de Graaff generator into his studio, capturing on film its 400,000 volt electrical charges. The end results look a bit like streaks of lightning branching off, root-like, from an incandescent spinal core, or they look like trees, or they look like Edward Weston's cabbage leaf. They look like bleached trunks and leaves and branches in a pitch-dark landscape, or like forms of primeval life turning and sending out fern-like tendrils of new growth in swirling water. So, in the cultural history of flash photography that I've been outlining, we see how it's been useful for practical ends, how it's been useful in journalism and in fine artwork. To be sure, flash is often irritating or invasive, and in the book I show how these associations of interruption and of irritation are taken up in literature and in film. But as Sugimoto's Lightning Fields suggests, the imaginative photographer can still turn sudden and surprising light to thought-provoking ends. Despite the bad press that flash photography has received, and I would argue plenty of times really quite justifiably, despite the bad press that it's received over the century and a half since its invention, something of its original wonder may still very effectively be reclaimed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have time for questions. Please raise your hand if you have a question. I can start with one whilst you're thinking. So my question would be, it seems quite unusual to specifically talk about flash photography. What got you interested in this subject?
I've got a background in both literature and in art history, and I've written quite a lot about Victorian visuality and visual cultures, and I was deeply aware that I hadn't ever written very much about photography. And so I started a project which was about language and photography and the kind of language that people use to write about photographic images and the taking of images and the representation of photographers within literary texts, that kind of thing. But I'm also a photographer. And I showed one of my pictures earlier of lightning striking over some hills in New Mexico. And I was just thinking, wow, it's hard, unless you're taking a video, to take photographs of lightning. And then I thought, I mean, you wouldn't use flash to take a lightning photo at night, but I wonder if people ever brought lightning and flash together. And so, yes, the tool was Google. I went off and thought, lightning, flash, photography. And I turned up so many references in the 19th century, in particular, that I started to write a lecture about that. I had to give a lecture at a conference on light. And it's like so often with projects, you start off with something that you think might be a chapter or even half a chapter. And before you know where you've gone, you've found out so much and you've gotten so excited about it that it's just mushroomed into an entire project. So that was how it got going. But I think that I'm intrigued that I myself very, very, very rarely use flash as a photographer. And I don't know if there are photographers among you here who want to claim, yes, I use it all the time. I'll do anything other than use flash, except for full photography in daylight. But I felt I'd learned a lot more, felt I'd gotten a lot more respect for the aesthetics of flash through writing this book. And so that was a really kind of great but surprising byproduct for me. Yes?
Thank you so much for this talk. It's amazing. As a continuation, actually, from what you said and from your question, do you think there is room, a good place for flash photography in today's society, given that it is considered intrusive, aggressive, quite violent? Where do you think flash could be better used?
I think sometimes it's just going to be necessary because you are somewhere where you can't bring in studio lights. But I think that, firstly, the improvement of digital photography and the speed of digital chips means that a lot of the time you don't need flash nearly as much as you used to. Just even for taking a photograph, an ordinary photograph in a room like this, you wouldn't even think probably about using flash. I'm much more intrigued by somebody, I mean, Martin Parr is the most obvious example I can think of, who does use flash in daylight and uses it to make colour pop out just a bit more. And now he knows he could make that colour pop with Photoshop, but he still prefers to use flash. But he's not using a flash attachment like most of us would use on a camera, or holding a flash gun at the side. He actually uses a ring flash, which was developed for taking photographs in your mouth at the dentist's. And so that doesn't show a big shadow. It was used a lot for fashion photography in the 1980s. There was a whole, there's an amazing kind of cover of Vogue with Linda Evangelista herself holding up a kind of a flash gun photographed using ring flash. And I think that that is an example of sort of experimentation with the lighting technique that happens to be flash, but happens to be the right technique for the effects that he's trying to create. But I do wonder whether the current photographic interest, or an interest that's been going on maybe 10, 15 years, in saying, let's use a photograph to think about flash and to think about the effects that it creates, whether they're good or bad, has something to do with a kind of a diminishing use of it, except in particular by paparazzi, by news photographers and such like. Though of course there's, ever since the allegations, which seem not to be true at all, that it was a flash going off being fired into Princess Diana's car that caused that car to crash, that kind of urban legend is one of many that has really consolidated the totally bad rap that flash has. So people then, you know, play and riff on that. Yes, I think I saw a hand first.
So you actually just mentioned the bad rap that flash has, and I guess to some degree it may be warranted, especially if it's used badly, like it might be by amateur photographers that, like, especially the on-camera flash. Like, I always have to, I'm sure you feel the same, but I always have to cringe when people, well, quite obviously use their camera in automatic mode, and then the pop-up flash pops up, and then they take a night photo outside and use the flash for that, or they take an indoor photo and completely ruin the image because that's what the pop-up flash normally does. Do you think there's a need for more education around good and bad uses of flash, and how could we go about this?
One of the things I totally loved about writing the book was immersing myself for a while in photo manuals, going back to the 19th century and all the way through the 20th century and into the 21st. And of course now there is masses of online information about how to use flash, how to take a good flash photograph, all the pitfalls not to fall into. So I honestly think it's one of those areas in which, if people want to have even rudimentary education, that they can find out. And I suppose a certain amount of education then comes in a sideways way when you see photographs that say no flash allowed here. And then you think, well, why not? So no flash allowed here might be at a sporting event, you're in an arena, and flash might just catch a player's eye and distract. Or you're told in a wildlife refuge that you can't use flash at all, because if you're taking pictures into a dark bush or at night, then that really would have a disruptive effect on the animals there. The whole question about whether or not you should or shouldn't use flash in museums is one which has really exercised museum curators, because they're probably, even with, you know, multiple uses of flash, there's very little these days, since flash bulbs going off isn't going to happen anymore. You know, they're not going to get their canvases spiked with those. So is it about copyright? Is it about disrupting the viewing experience? Is it just sort of traditional, we don't use flash in a museum? But I think it provokes people to say, well, why can't we use flash here, even at a kind of subliminal level? So I guess there's some kind of education going on there. I think what really gets me is when I see people using flash at a concert, say, and you just see all this light all over, and that's great for a cinematographer who wants to give some kind of sense of, I am at a concept. But this has been turned, that kind of phenomenon, to amazing use by this New York-based group called Improv Everywhere, which some of you will know for doing these sort of great, let's freeze for 5 minutes in Grand Central Station. So everybody, and you know, normal people, everyday people walking through Grand Central are going, what's happening here? But they had an experiment, an improv, where they asked people to turn up with their cell phones, with their point-and-shoot cameras and their flashes, and all let them off at the same time from Brooklyn Bridge. And photographs are taken of this, and of course it was entirely and utterly ineffectual. So it was one of those sort of demonstrations of both a communal event showing that, you know, flash perhaps doesn't do all that much. Yes?
Thanks. When did photographers really start to want to control the output and application of their flash using things like bounce and diffusers and umbrellas and all of that kind of stuff? And was that a long time after they'd already realised how unflattering the full-on flash effect is?
That's a great question, and it is one that I would say once you have the compound flash powder in particular, so post-1887, manuals and photographic magazines continue to be full of instruction about how you can bounce flash off a curtain at the side, or how you can use a newspaper that is held up, or how you can position flash in particular places within your fireplace, or how you can hang a gauze curtain over a window and let off flash behind it. And so one of those things that is compelling to me about the photo manuals of the late 19th and the early 20th century is how inventive, you know, so-called amateur photographers were. If you were a professional photographer, if you had a studio, you could afford some of those ready-made screens and hoods and devices that were advertised for use with flash. On the other hand, if you were a really well-to-do pensive photographer with a studio, you probably had electric lighting by that stage, but that's another question. But the amateur photographer was forever swapping stories about, hey, maybe you could use this, maybe you could use that. And so really, the whole history of photography has been asking, how do we control light? How do we use either natural light or artificial light, however it's produced, to create the particular either practical effects or aesthetic effects that we want? So the answer is that experimentation has been going on ever since people were using artificial lighting.
We would have time for one more question if anyone has one. If not, one question over there.
Hello. Hi.
Hi.
I wonder how you think about the future of the photography. If you kind of in line with the technological kind of developments, it will be interesting, your opinion. Thank you.
So the question's about how I see the technological future of photography and flash. And I think a lot there, I would take back to what I was saying about speed with digital photography. I mean, how fast, how sensitive can we make digital chips in terms of their reaction to light? Is flash going to seem like something which, you know, is some strange, quaint, old technology? We're going to talk about flash photography in retro terms at some point. I think we probably do that already in some quarters. But I also think that it's like one of those questions which is completely unanswerable, because it's going to be the more exciting photographers and artists and installation artists, and perhaps particularly installation artists like Eliasson, who will use flash as part of an installation. That show on light that was at the Serpentine a while back had some terrific examples of what one could call flash light, but used not to record a photographic image so much as to give the viewer a certain kind of experience when they were themselves at an installation, getting them to think about what light can do. So it's going to continue to be used in photography, but the imaginative ends to which it is put, I guess we all have to say, well, what do we want to do? What do we want to show? And how do we want people to think about light and the power of light? And in what ways do we calibrate between light's controllability and its unpredictability?
Thank you very much, Professor Kate Flint.
Thank you.